Well, hello again and welcome in. Wherever you are today and wherever you're listening from, I'm so happy to have you over to feast upon God's Word together. Get your plate ready today and take a seat. It's the 44, which is Matthew 4:4. Man cannot live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Let's eat. I'm your host, Jed Yancey, and welcome in today to episode 9 of the 4th season of the 44. And for those of y'all that have quite literally pulled a seat up to the table and eaten a meal with me, one of the things we likely both know about me is I just do not and cannot do spicy foods. Even just one touch and one taste of spicy is going to leave me sweaty, drinking tons of water, and I cannot even begin to tell you how many times someone has said to me, "Jed, are you sweating?" And I'm like, yeah, I am. What of it? But the worst part about it all is that I was raised in a home where you will not throw food away no matter what. So typically I just kind of fight through the sweats and go ahead and finish what I got in front of me usually. Now, when it's avoidable, I avoid. But every now and again, something will be offered and it just looks way too good on the palate to pass up. So spicy or not, I'm going to fight through it. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go for the pain, which much to my demise, because outside of just sweating while eating, when I eat spicy stuff, I get this thing called heartburn. Maybe you felt it before. And typically it shows its face in the middle of the night and it's just absolutely brutal. And I think most of us have experienced that feeling, to which every time I do it, and I eat spicy food and I get heartburn, it's like, man, I know better. What am I thinking? The food was really good, but it's just not worth it to do the very thing that I know is going to cause me pain, and yet I still do it, thinking, maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe this time I won't sweat. Maybe this time I won't get heartburn. But guess what? I do every time. That's the lead into what we're going to talk about. I've been doing a lot of reading on Solomon here lately and prep to teach a class starting Sunday on Ecclesiastes. And so much of what we're going to look at before we start into Ecclesiastes is this man Solomon, who was the son of David. And what is so intriguing to look at really, which we will on Sunday, not get all the way into here, is just the early life of Solomon and how he was raised and all that he saw and all that he became. But like if you were to go back and look at the very beginning of his life and being raised by his father David, who we know to be a man after God's own heart, and no matter his fall or his failure or screw up, he still had that heart for God. And when you look at some of the things that David says to his son at that time, young and inexperienced, his son Solomon, to find success, David says things like this: keep the law of the Lord your God. You will prosper if you're careful to observe the statutes and the ordinances which the Lord commanded. Be strong and be courageous. Do not fear. Do not be dismayed. Set your heart on and your soul to seek the Lord your God. I mean, over and over and over again, from father to son, we have these words. Now, what many of us know of Solomon is yes, of course, his wisdom. But part of what we read about his life is this in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, that Solomon loved the Lord and he walked in the statutes of his father David. Listen to this word: except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. And I just got to thinking about that word "accept" and the power of it in regards to my love for the Lord and walking in the ways he wants me to go, except right over here. I got this one exception, and it's mine. And no matter if it's not God's desire or God's will, I'm going to hang on to it. And I'm going to do it anyways. And through the life of Solomon, it appears as though by the end of his life, it turned into just one little bite here of the spicy food he knew that he couldn't and shouldn't eat. Just this one exception, and knowing it wouldn't go well in the first place, what we find out over the course of his life is it turns into scarfing down a whole plate of the spicy food that he knew was going to come with some consequences, that he had been warned about time and time and time again. Now, one exception here we see turned into so many others. More on that in just a minute. But I think what's also important here is that even after Solomon's father, David, passes away, like his voice is gone, he's died, and Solomon is officially king. Solomon prays a prayer in this same chapter, 1 Kings 3, and God answers. And a part of that is God saying the same thing his father once told him. Verse 14, if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. Now, any guesses right here for you guys as to which direction Solomon's heart turned over time? Was it back to God? Was it farther away from God? And to make a long story short, I want to fast forward to the end of his life where we read this in 1 Kings chapter 11, that King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh. The Moabite, the Ammonite, the Edomite, the Sidonian, the Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. But listen to this. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods. And his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. A little bit later, verse 9, it says, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Verse 11, so the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Do you see the heart burn because of heart turn? I mean, the end of all of that story for Solomon is God raises up some adversaries, and Solomon reigned 40 years as king and then died. But all that to say, or to get to what we're after today with this heart turn thing, because first and foremost, we're talking about what many of us know to be the wisest man to ever live, one who had it all, one who was king, one whose father was David, one who God spoke to, and yet his heart turned. Which the question should become first and foremost, man, I should do really well to pay attention and avoid this same mistake, right? I mean, for a guy like that to turn his heart, how much more then should I pay attention for the same thing not to happen? And then it's like, man, what is it that causes one's heart to turn in the first place and lead to heartburn? And I don't know if we can really answer this in one sitting and cover it all, except to say that what is visible through the life of Solomon is that what was once just an exception, and allowing that word accept to enter into his life, and then to get to a point where we just read at the end of his life, God says, don't do a thing. And in this case, don't associate with a certain people or marry a certain people. And here is why: your heart will turn from me, big G God, to their little g gods. And Solomon, we read, held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. His wives turned his heart away. And by the time he's old, the very thing God said would happen happened, as his heart turned away and he wasn't wholly devoted to God. It becomes so much more than a one-time, one exception kind of thing. It only grows and grows and grows. To which really I got to ask it today. I mean, like the results of just one time, one exception. What's the result of that? What's the result of one heart turn, even in a minor direction? What's the result of allowing that word accept to creep into who we are and what we do? It's major heartburn. In essence, consequences and pain. And we see it too in the life of, I mean, not just Solomon, we see it in the life of David, his father, where we read this in 1 Kings 15. David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life. Listen to this, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. And let me just ask you, if you know that story, are there any consequences, any heartburn associated with David's heart turn there in that exceptional case of Uriah the Hittite? Yeah, you remember he lost that first son. Now, real quick, as we go back to Solomon, I think it's really important to get in regards to these foreign women that, remember, God had said from the start, like all the way back, don't associate with them. Don't let them associate with you. And there was a reason why. That reason we just read a while ago, they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. And so, as I consider all this, first and foremost, like there's so many lessons and routes we could take here. What continues to pop into my mind and into my head is I keep thinking about what Paul says in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And I can't help but to think like that's what this is, right? I mean, what leads one into the pain and into the consequences that are associated with conforming to the pattern of the world and turning their heart away from God to all these other lowercase g gods out there? Well, it starts right here with this word accept, the making of one exception in one place, in one area, and sometimes with just one bite of spicy food. Now, maybe it looks like this in our lives that, well, yeah, I'll read my Bible, I'll show up to church, I'll do everything God commands, except when it comes to what I watch, except when it comes to what comes out of my mouth and what I say, except for maybe what goes into my mouth and into my body, except for how I treat people or how I raise my kids. I mean, whatever it is for you that is or has been our exception or your exception, I mean, it ultimately leads to another thing and then another thing. And ultimately what you got on your hands is a major case of heart turn and burn with pain and consequences. And now all of a sudden I'm holding hands with the world and with sin. So if that's us, what do we do about it? Well, personally, I can't help but to feel like maybe in those instances, in those situations, we've become so callous to the heartburn associated with heart turn. Like we learn to live with it and be okay with the consequences and be okay with the pain, to the point where the very pain and consequences I feel because of what I've done just really isn't all that bad anymore. And I kind of get used to it. To which I'd say here, that is perhaps one of the most spiritually dangerous places to be. So maybe let me suggest this. Our reaction to heart turn, even the slightest direction away from God, needs to be a whole lot greater than maybe what it normally is. We see some of this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. There is some of the same exact heart turn exceptions that ties right back into Solomon. I just want you to see maybe through the examples of Ezra and Nehemiah with the same exact heart turn situations, the great lengths to which they went, and maybe we need to go with ourselves and quite possibly others to fight against the grain of a heart turn which leads to consequences and pain. In Ezra 9, we read this, that the same stuff was going on. Ezra 9, 1 through 4, after these things had been done, the leaders came to Ezra and said, the people of Israel, including the priests and Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and all the ites. Verse 2, they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons. And listen to this, see if it sounds familiar. They have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them, and the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness. And when I heard this, Ezra says, I tore my tunic and cloak, I pulled my hair from my head and my beard, and I sat down appalled. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel gathered around me because of this unfaithfulness of the exiles, and I sat there appalled until the evening sacrifice. Now, there's a word in all of that jumps out to me. Maybe it did for you, and that word is appalled. When you think about that word, what does it mean? I mean, you can just see it. You can see its definition through Ezra's reaction. He pulls his hair, he yanks on his beard, he tears his clothes, and he sits there for a while appalled. And you know, I just can't help but to feel like maybe that is exactly what I want to do in the middle of the night after I eat spicy foods. Tear my clothes, pull my hair out. But on a more serious note, there comes a point in time with whatever it is that's caused my heart to turn, that it's like, come on, man, when is enough enough? This thing has become so much more than a one-time thing and one-time exception, and it's become bigger and it's serious and it's for real. And to that, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of hair to yank on or much right here on my chin, but I need to internally feel appalled at what it is that I've allowed to be that exception in my life. Then as you move over to Nehemiah, Nehemiah, the story here in the association with the same sin and the same exception is interesting, because these people set things back right in like Nehemiah, I think it's chapter 10, and they take this oath, to walk in God's law and to walk in all their ways, walk in all of his ways. And part of what they say is that, we're going to stop doing this thing, which is the same thing Solomon did. And they go so far as even signing their names to it, except that when you get to the end of the book of Nehemiah, he comes back to Jerusalem and it reads this way. In those days, I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod. None of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them, and I cursed them, and I struck some of them, and I pulled out their hair, and I made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. And you'll never guess, verse 26, who Nehemiah brings up and uses as an example. Listen to this. Did not King Solomon of Israel sin regarding these same things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you that you've committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? And man, again, I'm not trying to focus on this marrying of foreign women thing. It's just that's the common denominator or the common exception here in all of these, seen from Solomon to Ezra and Nehemiah's instances. But do you see how this cycle of heart turn is not just a one-time thing, but that over the course of our lives, not only do we need to recognize the turn away from God that happens through our use of exceptions, but our response to sin, to anything that turns our hearts away from God should be serious. And I don't know about y'all, But sometimes, like throughout the course of my life, I can point to these moments where I made one exception. Like, God, you get everything else, but this thing. And like Solomon, I'm going to hold fast to this thing in love. And where did it lead me? And if you can relate, where did it lead you? And as I think about that, ultimately, I found myself in a place where I hadn't just turned my heart a smidge or veered off track just a little, but I found myself in a place that I barely even recognized. Can I just suggest here today as we close that if that's you, just stop minimizing the sin. Maybe like Ezra, you need to and I need to sit there for a while appalled over my sin, over that exception I made, over what I've done and how far my heart has turned, and run back to God, to turn my heart back to keeping His commandments, keeping His testimonies, keeping His statutes without exception and without hard turn. I love you guys. Thank you so much for listening today. And until next week, keep on eating.